There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes after saying it's fine when you know it isn't. You've already forgiven them. You meant it mostly. But 3 days later, you're lying awake replaying the exact tone of their voice, and you can't figure out why your chest still feels tight. Most people would call that holding a grudge. Psychology calls it something else entirely, and you've probably felt this your whole life without naming it. The thing about people who forgive but never forget isn't that they're bitter. Bitterness is hot. This is cold. This is a quiet, surgical precision where you choose to move forward, but you file the event away in a drawer labeled "Do not trust fully again." You don't bring it up. You don't punish them. You just remember. And that memory changes everything without anyone else noticing. Here's where it gets interesting. When you forgive someone but keep the memory active, your brain isn't malfunctioning. It's actually performing a hyper-efficient risk assessment. Most people assume forgiveness erases the data, but your nervous system doesn't care about politeness. It cares about survival. And if someone hurt you once, your amygdala flags them as a low-grade threat permanently. Not dangerous enough to cut off, just dangerous enough to never relax around again. That's not pettiness. That's pattern recognition. You're not holding on to the past. The past is holding on to a blueprint inside you, and your brain keeps checking it because it's terrified of being blindsided twice. And you've probably felt guilty about this for years, thinking you're not a real forgiver because you didn't wipe the slate clean. But real forgiveness was never about amnesia. This is why you never fully reopen to certain people, even after you've made peace. But there's a second layer most people miss. The forgive but never forget response is almost always found in people who are highly intelligent and emotionally sensitive. Not because they are dramatic, but because they process more information per interaction. A normal person hears an insult. You hear the insult, plus the micro-expression before it, plus the historical pattern of similar moments, plus the subtext of what wasn't said. That's not overthinking. That's just having more data. And when you have more data, you can't unsee it. You cancel plans with that person last minute and feel relief. You tell yourself you're just tired. But that's not social anxiety. That's emotional self-preservation. Your brain protecting your mental energy because it knows social performance costs you twice as much as others. You're not broken. You just learned early that being alone is safer than being misunderstood. And when someone proves they don't understand you, your memory becomes a gatekeeper. Now watch how this backfires. Because the cruel irony is that your ability to remember emotional data so precisely also means you remember every time you hurt someone else. You replay your own mistakes with the same brutal clarity, and that creates a quiet hypocrite inside you. You forgive others but not yourself. You hold their past actions in a mental folder while burning your own into your chest. And you'd never admit that out loud. But here's the weird part you've probably never said to anyone. The reason you don't forget isn't punishment, it's preparation. Every time you remember what someone did, you're silently rehearsing what you'll do if it happens again. You're building an escape route. You're testing exits. You're not living in the past. You're living in a future where you've already survived the worst version of that person. And that feels like safety. Except it's not safety. It's exhaustion wearing a mask. And this is the part that will surprise you. People who forgive but never forget actually have higher emotional intelligence than people who genuinely move on completely. Because moving on completely requires either denial or a very shallow emotional range. You can't truly forget a betrayal and still be intelligent. Forgetting requires deleting data, and your brain refuses to delete something that might save you later. That's not a flaw. That's your intelligence refusing to lie to you. But why does your brain keep doing this even when it hurts you? Because somewhere early in your life, probably before you were 10 years old, you learned that adults don't protect you consistently. Maybe they apologized but repeated the behavior. Maybe they said "I love you" but their actions said something else. And your child brain made a silent contract. I will forgive to keep the peace, but I will remember to keep myself safe. That contract is still running. You're still 5 years old inside, watching a parent make the same promise again, and your memory is the only wall you have left. You're not cynical. You're just trained. And here's the layer no one talks about in these psychology videos. The never forget part isn't about the other person at all. It's about you proving to yourself that you're not stupid. Because if you forgot, that would mean you approved of how they treated you. And your dignity cannot allow that. So you hold the memory like a receipt that says this happened, I did not imagine it, and I am not crazy. Every time you replay it, you're not seeking pain. You're seeking validation for your own reality. That's why you can't just let it go when people tell you to. Letting go feels like gaslighting yourself. Now watch what happens when two people like this get into a relationship. They both forgive. They both never forget. And suddenly you have two archives running in parallel, each one quietly keeping score of who hurt whom first. No one yells. No one fights. But the warmth leaks out slowly, like air from a tire. Because neither of them feels safe enough to be spontaneous. They are both too busy remembering. And you've probably lived this. The relationship that looked fine from the outside but felt like a museum of past disappointments inside. This is why you never felt fully at home with certain friends either. You forgave them for that rude joke 3 years ago. You genuinely don't want revenge, but when they text you now, you take 2 hours to reply. Not because you're busy. Because the memory sits between you like a glass wall and you can't figure out how to break it without cutting yourself. But here's the question you're afraid to ask yourself. What if the person you've never forgiven is yourself? Because the forgive but never forget pattern turns inward more often than people admit. You remember that embarrassing thing you said at a party 5 years ago. You remember that failure at work. You remember the relationship you ruined. And you've told yourself you forgive yourself. You really have. But the memory is still there, glowing softly, reminding you not to get too confident. And that's not humility. That's your own brain policing you with a permanent record. You're not lazy. You're just exhausted by a judge that never adjourns. And this is the part where most scripts would tell you to practice radical forgiveness or learn to release. But that's not useful to you. Because you already know how to forgive. That was never the problem. The problem is that your memory works exactly the way it should for a person who has been hurt by someone they trusted. The real question isn't how do I forget? The real question is why do I keep putting myself in situations where remembering is necessary? You don't have a memory problem. You have a boundary problem. Because people who forgive but never forget are almost always people who are terrified of being seen as difficult. So you say it's fine when it isn't. You forgive without resolution. You accept apologies that didn't feel real. And then your memory becomes the only place where your truth is allowed to exist. You don't forget because you never truly resolved. You just skip the resolution to be polite. And politeness is not peace. Now here's the uncomfortable truth your therapist might not say directly. The never forget part will never go away. Not fully. And you need to stop waiting for it to disappear. Because that waiting is the actual suffering. You keep thinking there's a version of you in the future who has let this go. But that version doesn't exist. The version that exists is the one who remembers and chooses to stay anyway. That's not weakness. That's the most honest form of love there is. Love that sees the full file and stays open anyway. But staying open doesn't mean staying naive. So if you've ever felt guilty for bringing up something someone did 6 months ago, stop. You're not punishing them. You're asking them to acknowledge that your memory exists. And if they can't handle that, the problem isn't your memory. It's their comfort. The quietest superpower you have is that you see people clearly. You see their patterns. You see the gap between their words and their actions. And you still choose to stay. That's not holding a grudge. That's holding a map of who they really are. And you're not using it for revenge. You're using it to navigate. That's wisdom. It just looks like suspicion from the outside. But here's the final layer. The one that will make you put down your phone. What if the reason you never forget is because you're afraid that if you let go completely, you'll have no proof that you were ever hurt? And if you have no proof, then maybe you were overreacting the whole time. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe you're just too sensitive. So you hold on to the memory like a wound you refuse to close, because a closed wound means you have to go back into the world and risk being cut again. The memory isn't the problem. The memory is your excuse to stop trying. And you've probably felt that, late at night. The realization that you're not protecting yourself anymore. You're just hiding. Most people will tell you to forgive and forget, but those people are either lying or lucky. You are neither. You're someone who sees too much to pretend. And that's not a curse. That's just expensive. It costs you peace. It costs you spontaneity. It costs you the ability to trust without a footnote. But it also means you will never be blindsided by someone you love. You'll see it coming. And maybe that's the trade. So if you've ever felt like you're speaking a different language than everyone else when it comes to forgiveness, you're not crazy. You're just wired to remember what they choose to forget. And that's not a flaw. That's the whole point. You didn't break. You just stopped lying to yourself about who people are. If your mind works like this, you'll find the same patterns in the next video. Subscribe if you want to understand yourself more than you want to fit in.